In horse racing's 2023, there will be no Triple Crown winner, but there have been 12 dead horses at the most famous racetrack in America, Churchill Downs. It sparked a major investigation by the new Horse Racing Authority that appears to be following PETA's suggestions. It could shut down racing there until the mystery of the dead horses is solved. That's next on the PETA Podcast. Welcome to the PETA Podcast. I'm Guillermo, your host for this inside look at animal rights, brought to you by PETA, the largest animal rights organization in the world. On today's episode, an emergency summit of HISA, the Horse Racing Integrity and Safety Authority, the new federal regulators of the sport. They convened at Churchill Downs in Kentucky, all after 12 horses died there, including one set to run in the Kentucky Derby. PETA wrote HISA earlier in May when the death toll was at 2. The letter had specific recommendations that HISA now seems to be taking to heart, and it could include shutting down Churchill until it's safe to race. Here's Kathy Guillermo, who heads PETA's horse racing department, on the PETA Podcast.
The first death at Churchill Downs came the week before the Kentucky Derby. And at the second death, a few days later, PETA requested that Churchill Downs close the track, get to the bottom of why these deaths were occurring, and take actions to prevent them. Churchill Downs didn't do that. And now, in the last month, there have been 12 horses who have died. And this is something that can't carry on anymore. And fortunately, we've been able to keep it in the news. People agree with us. The coverage is all about the deaths and what's going to be done. Then on Preakness Day, 2 weeks after the Kentucky Derby, one horse died, not during the Preakness Stakes, but in an earlier race. And that focused yet more attention on the fact that at the very highest level of horse racing, horses are shattering their bones on the track and being euthanized.
So give me a sense of context here about the deaths. We've had 12 deaths as we speak. How significant are 12 deaths? I mean, are deaths frequent?
Well, let's be very clear about Churchill Downs. Yes, it is the most famous racetrack in America, one of the most famous in the world, home to the most famous race in the world, the Kentucky Derby, but it's been a deadly track for years. Horses have died there year after year after year. Churchill Downs has not been exceedingly transparent about it, hasn't reported publicly on the deaths. But I think what is a bit different right now is that we are talking Triple Crown season. And for those who are unfamiliar with racing, these are the three most famous races in America: the Kentucky Derby, the Preakness Stakes, and the Belmont Stakes, beginning with the Kentucky Derby. And when we're talking about more than a dozen deaths in this most famous racing time of year, then yes, this is not something that even horse racing officials can ignore. And we know they're pretty good at ignoring this kind of thing.
You know, in the past, when a horse died, it was never really considered a big deal. I mean, it was a loss of life, but it was just considered, well, this is what happens in racing. It's only because PETA began paying attention to the rising number of deaths in places like Los Angeles, where Santa Anita is, specifically in Arcadia, California. And there was that time a few years back when there were, I believe, 30 horse races dead. Now they seem to take it a lot more seriously, and everywhere, not just in LA, but everywhere where there's racing. You know, for years, a horse would die, and it would, if it was a champion horse, it would create some news. But for the most part, when an average run-of-the-mill horse breaks down and dies at a racetrack, it was just considered a normal thing.
We've changed that narrative. Horse racing will never go back to those days. And it began back in 2008 when we launched a campaign against the cruelty of horse racing. And it's gone through 9 different undercover investigations that we have done about various aspects of the cruelty in horse racing, beginning with the drugging of horses, the legal medicating of horses that leads directly to their breakdown and death, to investigations of the transport of horses to Canada and Mexico for slaughter, to the sales of racehorses to Korea, South Korea, and to Japan, where they all eventually end up in slaughterhouses, to the under-tack shows, the so-called 2-year-olds in training sales, in which horses are sold at auction and they are just barely 2 years old, some of them not even chronologically 2 years old, and they are run faster than they ever will be in their lives, risking their limbs. Some of them die. From all of these investigations, we have educated the public. So we can't take complete credit for the attention that is on the deaths right now, because it is a changing public view of horse racing. We have, through the years, educated people about what happens to animals when they're used for entertainment in this way. And the American public has decided they don't want to tolerate this. And I think that's become very clear. The horse racing industry has fought back against it, but this is not a story they're going to undo. So they really need to deal with it. And that's what we've been working on.
And let's point out that among the 12 deaths that have occurred, you had one that was on its way to race at the Kentucky Derby, and was scratched because of death. I mean, that's quite unusual.
That's right. The first death was a horse called Wild on Ice, who was slated to run in the Derby and fractured a leg before the race. And we should look for just a moment at what these deaths were. Of these 12 horses who died at Churchill Downs within the last month, there were 2 who collapsed and died for unknown reasons. Not clear what's happened with them. There was one horse who reared up while he was being prepared to go to the racetrack, fell back and broke his neck. And then the rest of the horses broke legs on the track. So as usual, we're looking at horses who for some reason were not really ready to run, in our view, that there was something wrong with these horses. And the one that breaks my heart the most is a horse called Lost in Limbo. I mean, every death is a tragedy, because we have to remember this is not a statistic. These are individual horses. These are horses who cling to their life just as we do to ours. Lost in Limbo raced last week, and we had somebody at the track who was filming the races that day. And this horse escaped before the race. They were trying to load him into the starting gate. He broke away from his handler. He bucked the jockey off his back and he ran. He ran practically the full length of the back stretch of the track trying to get away. And they caught him. And at that point, he should have been removed from the race. That's what typically happens under these circumstances when a horse gets away like that, because they could injure themselves as they're escaping. It's not clear to us that he had any veterinary exam or even a cursory one. And he was put into the starting gate and he was forced to race. And as he crossed the finish line, he just crashed hard into the dirt on his face. And he tried to get out. It is just the most heartbreaking video. And we've released that. People can Google PETA video Lost in Limbo to see it, because I want everybody to see it, even though it will break your heart, because this was a horse who was trying not to race, trying desperately to get out of it. And we can't know what was in his mind. Did he hurt? Was his leg sore and he wasn't able to communicate it? He certainly was terrified about it. And that's how his life ended.
Let's address how or why the horses are dying. It's one thing that comes to mind is, could it be the track? Could it be the surface? But it's not really the surface. It has to be something else. What do you suppose?
Everybody in racing is well aware of what causes most of the deaths on the track. We know from studies that have been done over the last several decades that 90% of horses who break bones on the track had an injury at the very site where that bone broke. So for some reason, that injury is not being detected. There can be any number of reasons that singly or together contribute to a horse breaking a bone on the track. A horse could be injured and be given medication that masks that injury so he's not showing it. Horses sometimes get tired and worn out and are raced too frequently. And that micro damage that comes from running breaks their bones down. It could be that. Did anybody at Churchill Downs look at the records of these horses? Did they look at their medication records to see if they had been treated for injury? Did they see if they'd had any long layoffs between races, which would also indicate some kind of an injury? Yes, the track has to be looked at, but this is the narrative that people in racing continually want to go to. There must be some freak thing wrong with the track. It has nothing to do with the track. Now, that said, that's another way that they could improve this racing industry is by replacing the turf and the dirt tracks with a synthetic surface, which everyone knows is by far the safest surface to race on. So all of these things have to be looked at, and all of them should be looked at before the horse ever gets on that track. And I hold the track and the stewards in Kentucky responsible for not doing this.
It sounds like that horses are allowed to race when they shouldn't. And then when they do race, they exert themselves and put extra pressure on, say, something that's infirm within their bodies, and then they break down, break a leg, and then are euthanized. I mean, that's sort of the shorthand version of what happens.
That's a very good description. And that is why on May 2nd, we went to Churchill Downs and we asked them to suspend racing until every one of these deaths could be investigated. This was May 2nd, when only 2 horses had died. If they had listened, there would be 10 horses likely, or certainly many more who are alive now that now aren't alive. When Churchill Downs did not respond and suspend racing, we went to the group called HISA. It's the Horseracing Integrity and Safety Authority. It's the new federal authority that is supposed to be on top of these things. It took them 12 deaths to take action. Now, to be fair, they only came into power about a week and a half ago. But nevertheless, it was only yesterday that they called an emergency racing summit. That's what they've called it. It's a meeting of people who are trying to figure out and get to the bottom of this. And they're doing exactly, according to news reports, what we told Churchill Downs to do on May 2nd. They're looking at the veterinary records. They're looking at what these horses have been through. They're interviewing the trainers. They're interviewing the jockeys. They're interviewing the stewards. They're looking at the track. They're now doing that. What they should do is suspend racing right now while they're investigating. And we did ask for that. We called for that very strongly. There was talk that it might happen. The New York Times reported today that they may pause racing at Churchill Downs, which would be the responsible thing to do. But as of right now, which is Wednesday, May 31st, 8:30, almost 8:30 in the evening Eastern time, they have not suspended racing.
And is there any doubt in your mind that that should be the proper action at this point?
It's only logical. They are trying to figure out what is killing horses during training and racing. So if they know horses are dying during training and racing, it only makes sense to stop training and racing until they figure it out, because to do anything else is to risk those horses. It's just irresponsible. To my mind, this is HISA's first test as a federal body, and they seem to be failing it. Now, they haven't shut down the possibility of pausing racing completely yet. They may come out tomorrow and say no racing on Friday, Saturday, and Sunday, but they should do it tomorrow, Thursday, which is when the horses and the trainers will be back on the track ready to race.
And HISA, again, is a new federal authority funded by the government. They're put into action by Congress. Was it a bipartisan decision, Republicans and Democrats?
Well, one correction, it is actually funded by the tracks themselves. They have to pay the Horseracing Integrity and Safety Authority, HISA, in order to be part of the program. But yes, this was a bipartisan bill that originally grew out of PETA's investigation of the trainer Steve Asmussen. When we showed that Asmussen's barn, and in fact many barns, and barn being the term that's used, or stable being the term that's used to refer to all of the horses under the care of particular trainers, when we showed that over-medicating horses to keep them running when they should be recuperating from racing was so commonplace that it was dangerous to the horses, it created a huge stir. That was released back in 2014. It took this much time to get this bill passed, but the wonderful thing about it is that for decades, progressive people in racing, if there are such a thing, have been saying we need federal authority. And this is the first time that there is any federal authority about integrity and safety issues at racetracks in the United States.
So they're not biased toward maybe keeping the racetracks alive. They're funded by the racetracks. Is there a bias there, or are they truly independent, looking at the safety of the horses? What is their primary concern?
I think it remains to be seen how it will work. There are a lot of people involved who have been involved in racing. And so we worry about that, of course. We worry about the fact that people who are and have been involved in racing are now regulating racing, which is what the problem has been so far. I'd like to give them the benefit of the doubt, but who knows? They are supposed to look at illegal doping, at the use of medications at racing, and any other issue that involves the welfare or the safety of the horse.
What do you think is going to get to the bottom of this? I mean, they're looking at veterinary records, which is amazing to me that that's something they hadn't done to date. They're not even doing something that would be more efficient, like the scanning of racehorses, but before a race. But what do you think is going to be the key that could help them make the right decision for the horses?
It's hard to know without transparency. I would hope that they're going to be honest about what it is they find. Are they going to find that these horses have showed some kind of injury that hasn't been dealt with appropriately, that they've been raced too often, or that there is some kind of information that will emerge? But it's going to be very hard to know unless they release all this information. And that's another thing that we advocate for, is complete transparency in racing. Complete. There should be information out about every single horse who's going to race on every single day. And this is not impossible. This is done in Hong Kong. And they have information on a website that will say things like 8 oats well this morning, or a little warmth in the left front foot. They will report on the condition of every horse. And they do it because it's completely transparent, not only to bettors who are making decisions, but to the general public and to everybody who's deeply concerned about these horses as we are.
Well, you just mentioned another aspect of this that is really kind of concerning. There are people who bet on races, not just in Kentucky, but because these races are simulcast throughout the country. All across the country, people are betting on horses. Is it a fair game when horses that shouldn't be running are somehow drugged so that they don't appear infirm and then they're on the racetrack? Is that fair that these horses who are unwell are allowed to run, and then people are allowed to put their hard-earned dollars on these horses in a gambling proposition?
Well, let me preface this by saying that there's nothing fair about horse racing. The horse gets no say in it. The horse cannot decide, okay, today's the day that I want to run a race. No, this horse lives in a stall 23 hours out of every 24. These horses are deprived of practically everything that's natural and normal to them. They're herd animals. They want to be with other horses. They want a bit of freedom. Yes, they want to run, but they want to run on their terms. All of the freedom is taken away. So when we talk about fairness, we have to start there. These are not willing participants. You can see a human bicyclist or a swimmer or somebody who risks a certain amount of injury, a football player, for example, where we know that sport can be quite dangerous. Those are all willing participants, and they get paid for what they do. Horses get food and they get a certain amount of care. And when people are done with them, they can get sold at auction and go to slaughter. It's so wrong and so unfair. But back to your question about the bettor, no, it's absolutely not fair. And that's why we worked with one gambler who had bet on a trotting horse, a horse involved in harness racing, as opposed to the thoroughbred racing that we're talking about now, and found out later that the horse had been doped and brought a lawsuit. And he brought a lawsuit against the trainer, because ultimately it is the trainer who's responsible, and the owner. And that suit was successfully settled in favor of the bettor. And the idea was not to promote betting. What we're trying to say is that this is really wrong in every way what you're doing. And if you're going to drug horses, you're going to pay for it. You're going to pay for it in every way that we can make you pay for it.
And one thing you should say, I guess, also about, and I guess one thing you should say about the drugging of horses, it's not necessarily to make them run faster. It's just to get them well enough so that they can go on the track. It's not a matter of they will run fast because of the drugs. It's that they will appear well enough to run, period.
That is so often the case, according to the studies that we have read. And many of these studies are out of University of California at Davis, where they do the necropsies or the autopsies on the horses. And that's exactly right. And what we have documented in our investigations is a whole cocktail of medications and various substances given to horses in the weeks leading up to the race, from anti-inflammatories to take away that pain, as you say, so that they can actually get out there and move, to sedatives, because horses are very nervous sometimes. This is not necessarily something they want to do, and they get freaked out when they get on the track, as we saw Lost in Limbo do, to all kinds of bizarre medications that we've seen. At the time that we did our investigation, trainers were giving horses or were making sure that horses got thyroid medication, even though they don't have thyroid disease. Many jurisdictions have outlawed that now since our investigation revealed it. But that's right. There's all kinds of use of drugs that put horses at risk and that are unfair to the horses. And that is why we say there should be no medication for horses within 2 weeks of a race. None at all. If the horse is not well, the horse shouldn't be racing, period.
And HISA has the ability to shut down or make that recommendation. Does the track have, are they under obligation to listen?
Churchill Downs has said it will listen if HISA advises it to shut down. I don't know how accurate that would be. And strictly speaking, it's my understanding that while HISA cannot itself shut down the track, what it can do is prevent the simulcast of racing to and from that track, which means that they can't be live streaming those races at Churchill Downs to other places where people are betting, and they can't bring the streaming of races into Churchill Downs so that people there can bet on those. And that's a big part of the gambling world in racing. They bet on races all over the country and sometimes all over the world from one location through these streaming services. So Churchill Downs would lose a lot of money if they lose their ability to stream races.
And so they would want to comply, or they would want to make sure that they were always up for every race.
Well, the one thing that I've noticed about the horse racing industry is that it doesn't like to operate in its own best interest. I mean, it would have seemed quite logical to us in the week before the Kentucky Derby that they shut it down and they put in place safety protocols that they apparently have not had in place, shockingly, and get that ready before the Kentucky Derby. That would have been the logical and sensible thing to do. And they perhaps could have avoided most of the scrutiny and scandal, and most importantly, perhaps avoided many of those deaths. They don't want to do what's best for them. They want to do what's going to make them money.
Well, people are focused on Kentucky because that's where the deaths are, but there are deaths wherever there are horses running throughout the country.
That is the truth about racing, and the scandal about racing is that it's not an anomaly in any way. It is shocking that at this highest level, you are seeing this number of deaths, when, if anywhere, the horses should be well cared for and protected. It's at these highest levels, one would think. But no, death happens all the time. And we're headed into the Belmont Stakes. That is what's called the third leg of the Triple Crown. The third race is June 10th. And Belmont is one of the deadliest tracks in America. We have gone to the New York Gaming Commission and said, before this Belmont Stakes, please require every owner to have the legs of their horses scanned with the CT imaging equipment, which should reveal many, if not all, of the microdamage and possible pre-existing injuries where these breaks are prone to happen. This seems a perfectly logical solution. The Melbourne Cup in Australia, which is like the Kentucky Derby over there, they started doing this a few years ago because they had scandals with deaths. And the first year that they did it, they took 2 horses out of the race. It was quite controversial, but they had no deaths. There was so much pushback that the next year they didn't do the scans and a horse died. So the following year, they put the scan requirement back in place and they haven't had deaths. So this is entirely logical. And yet, again, racing not acting in its own best interest has refused. We got a letter from the New York State Gaming Commission saying, nope, not going to do that.
And you really think that the use of scans prior to the race to either clear a horse for racing or to qualify a horse for racing on the basis of its health, that would curtail the number of deaths we're seeing right now, especially in Kentucky?
I think there's no question. And as listeners of this podcast know, we have advocated for many years for the use of the curve beam CT imaging equipment, which is low radiation scanning equipment that the horse can step on. There are no moving parts to frighten the horse. A few minutes later, the horse steps off, and there are three-dimensional scans of all four legs. What we have advocated for is a year-long study of this equipment at a track, which is what it would take to input all the information into the patented software so that the screening of the horses could be done preventatively, not diagnostically, meaning that a horse could go through this, or 50 horses could go through this procedure. The machine itself would spit out the report. So you wouldn't have to have a veterinarian sitting there and reading every single scan that came out. So you could do a high volume of animals, and you could find out exactly what's going on with that animal. And if there was any question of vulnerability, that animal could be prevented from running. It's so entirely logical. And it's my view that the racing industry fights it because they're afraid of how many horses are going to be ruled ineligible to race if they actually take a look at the scans of their legs.
Well, we saw at the Kentucky Derby the number of horses who were scratched, as they call it, deemed unfit to run on race day. So how much more if there were scans to actually show people, here's why this horse isn't running.
Yes, and avoiding the use of these scans because you don't want to know the information is a pretty sorry excuse for letting horses die. And the fact that there were so many horses who were pulled from races on Kentucky Derby Day, where they have quite a number of races on that day, was an indication of how worried Churchill Downs was that a horse would die. And yet, of course, 2 horses died, even with what they did. So there can be no excuse for this any longer. It's our view that if even one horse dies in racing, you cannot have racing. It is not acceptable to kill an animal for an entertainment, period. That should be the way it is. So all of these people who are saying it's impossible to have horse racing without some deaths, well, then you've just sealed your own fate.
It was something to see a horse die on Derby Day and then to hear the announcer say, well, meanwhile, back to Derby Day, that was a little odd. One final question, Kathy, is HISA prepared to be the heavy here? And would they have the authority to require the CT scans?
I think it remains to be seen. This is very much an unknown quantity to me right now. You know, when we did the Asmussen investigation and the legislation was introduced, I think we all had such high hopes. We have to wait and see. I think HISA has a lot of authority and a lot of power and can make change. Are they going to do it? I just don't know. Horse racing is a very political industry.
Kathy Guillermo, who leads PETA's horse racing department. As we release this podcast, HISA has not yet suggested shutting down horse racing at Churchill. Go to PETA.org for more on the horse racing campaign, and go to the podcast website link in the show notes for updates on HISA's investigation of Churchill Downs. And that's our show for today. Thank you for listening. Don't forget to send a link of this show to your friends. Tell them you like the PETA Podcast. Contact us at PETA.org. You can find me on Twitter at Emil Amok. That's EMILAMOK. Or see my vlog at AMOK.com. Or see my work at ALDEF, the Asian American Legal Defense and Education Fund. That's ALDEF aaldef.org/blog, or get this podcast on YouTube at Emil Amok 1. Once again, thank you for listening. Check out all our episodes on your favorite podcast app or on Apple Podcasts, where you can subscribe to, as well as rate and review the show. It helps get the word out about the issues you care about. Our music is provided by Carbon Works. Check them out on YouTube. And join us again next time for more insight into animal rights and the fight for a cruelty-free world on the PETA Podcast. I'm Emil Guillermo.